Welcome. Welcome. I'm Jeff Cyphers, Chair of CC Power, and calling this meeting to order at 1 p.m. I verify that we have reached a quorum and have not been notified of any matters subsequent to posting the agenda. So I'll give it a moment. I see we have at least two attendees, and call for any public comment on matters that are not listed on the agenda. And reminder for those who might be new to this, we use the raised hand feature on my screen. That's at the bottom of my screen, but maybe your Zoom is different. So if you wish to make a comment, please raise your hand now. Not seeing raised hands. So let's move on to the consent agenda. This is just a single item, the minutes from April 24. Is there any corrections to the minutes or discussion? Not seeing any there. So was that a motion?
Yes.
Okay, let's look for a second and then I'll call for comment.
I'll second that.
Okay, San Francisco second, and then let's look for any public comment on the minutes from April 24. Not seeing any raised hands, so let's call that item, please.
Okay, for the consent agenda, Ava Community Energy is absent. Central Coast Community Energy,
Yes.
Clean Power SF,
Yes.
Peninsula Clean Energy. Think you're on mute. If we could get Peninsula one more time.
Apologies, yes.
Okay, thank you. Redwood Coast Energy Authority. And again, I think that was on mute.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. San Jose Clean Energy,
Yes.
Silicon Valley Clean Energy,
Yes.
Sonoma Clean Power Authority,
Yes.
Valley Clean Energy.
Yes.
Thank you. The consent agenda passes.
That moves us to our regular calendar. Two items, the general manager report and a proposed budget discussion. So I'll turn it over to you, General Manager Morris.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today. We have a couple items I wanted to run you through on the GM update, and then we'll get into a discussion on budget and then a closed session. So thanks everybody for attending. The GM update has a couple miscellaneous updates, so we'll share some slides just to walk you through it. And as usual, I welcome discussion. First off, no general manager activity that's reportable from the past month. So thank you on that. Nothing to disclose. And then I have a few updates on the next slide. These are somewhat administrative, but I did want to, make sure everybody's aware of what's coming. So a few items here. One is the build transfer agreement phase 2A project. That was approved through resolution 240104 back in January. We were going to hold off on invoicing that, but in the end, it seems like we're ready and we have a cost sharing agreement finalized. So we will issue these invoices and cost sharing agreements in conjunction towards the end of May. So those will be coming. As a reminder, that whole project was a not to exceed of $440,000 associated with running, administering the phase 2A. We have all 9 members participating. And so the individual invoices are around $44,000 each. Okay. One other update. We talked last month on this memorandum of understanding on an offshore wind project where we're trying to learn more and continue to engage pursuant to the board's direction. The offshore wind project, as you may recall, is called Podimo. And so the press release went out. We did have some questions come up. It was posted in Politico and a few other spots. And we also may further explain just a little bit of our thinking on why we think this is a helpful step. And we would do that through a blog. We don't normally have blogs, but it's just a simple way to sort of put some of our thinking out on our website. So I was going to proceed with that, but I wanted to socialize that first with you guys. One other thing to note is this is really just about explaining why we thought the MOU was a helpful step, reminding people of the board's directives to CC Power on exploring and taking strategic actions on offshore wind, while also clarifying this is not a contract for offshore wind. So that's the gist of the blog. And I wanted to just make sure everybody was comfortable with that. And if you have any feedback, we can discuss it now, or please let me know. Okay. And again, feel free to chime in anytime. A couple other updates. So you may know, and many of you, thanks for your support. We've been bringing a lot of policies to the board throughout the first half of this year. And this was actually planned in something we discussed last year, getting a lot of these roles and responsibilities and other policies set up for CC Power to sort of better manage and operate pursuant to board direction. So just as a recap on 2024, we've adopted these 5 policies: the roles and responsibilities, which includes data confidentiality approaches, and then also going after roles and responsibilities. The getting it right agreements, delegation of authority, financial policy, a budget policy, and then actually we're up at 6, and then a new member policy. So sorry about the typo there. And one quick update here is the roles and responsibilities. The way we approach that was there's an annual agreement. So as we head into the next fiscal cycle, I wanted to remind everyone we will be tuning up that agreement, and we'll send that out in conjunction with everybody for the upcoming year. Okay. Your general counsels have been involved in that, and I'm happy to set up time to meet if anybody wants to further look through that. Okay. All right, next slide. And then one other update, and this is more for you and your staff. We, as CC Power has grown, we have 4 projects, 4 contracts. We have working groups, and members want access to the right information. So we've undertaken a project to improve member file sharing and access. Related to this, we want to make sure we have up-to-date distribution lists so all of your staff are getting the right information. And so this project has been developing. We developed a plan. We looked at how Cal CCA approaches it, and we've been trying to replicate their model because we know a lot of you and your staff are all members of Cal CCA, and that seems to be functioning sufficiently. And so where we're at now is we're going to start to implement it. We're going to move forward with an Office 365 model similar to Cal CCA. And so it'll have a sort of beefed up file sharing distribution list calendar functions. It'll have a better structure for helping members get access. And then we'll end up registering the members so that they're all plugged in on anything they want that's appropriate. Some of this is easy because we can give all members access to phase 1 work. Some of it's more complicated where we have restricted access on projects, and only the participants in a project should have their staff access that. So the implementation rollout starts in June. We'll give instructions to everyone. Later in June, we'll then start to register everyone, and then they'll be able to start logging in by mid-June and using the service. And with that, we'll start to sunset some of the models where we're sending out these expiring links to everyone, which has been cumbersome and often flawed. So we think this will be a better outcome for your staff. There'll also be a board file that'll have a lot of the board documents, and we'll have a few other files as well. So any questions on these updates? Any comments? Everybody okay? Okay, Chair Cyphers. So I think that wraps up the GM report for this month.
Sounds good. So let's move on to the proposed budget discussion. Or should we let's take public comment on that. We can take comment twice. So let's take any public comment on the general manager's report this time. If there is any. Okay, don't see any hands, so let's move on to 6B.
Chair Cyphers, would you like me to kick things off, or anything you want to start? I'm happy to lead it, and as many of you have been involved in, Treasurer Sears also may have been involved to some
I think
degree.
it's good if you can get into your proposal, and then also a little bit about the administrative timeline, given that you're looking for us to discuss it today and not vote. So if you can give us a little bit of that, that would be helpful.
Yes, okay. So thanks, everybody. I wanted to walk you through what we're now calling the recommended budget. And this is reflects the strategic plan, the work plan that we've developed for the upcoming year, and then how that maps into the budget. So at the end of this, we'll go into some details of the recommended budget. Hopefully there'll be some good discussion, and we're not requesting a vote today on this. The plan is to have a vote in June. So there's definitely an opportunity to continue to address input concerns on where we land on the budget. And then also we want to have a bit of a conversation about your side of the process. What do you need for your own approvals, and making sure we have better linkages there. So if we give you a recommended budget, you have time to go through your own approval process if appropriate on the budget ask. Okay. So let me jump in. There'll be a lot of opportunities for comments and questions, and thanks to everybody who's had a chance to provide input on all of this work, including the work plans. Next slide, please, Amy. Okay, so, just very high level, there was a board-approved strategic plan back in 2022 from Phyllis Curry, who's a longtime participant in joint action agencies similar to CC Power. That plan laid out a vision and mission, some resourcing ideas, some near-term project ideas, and then also highlighted how there's kind of this vision of growing the organization over time. There was a couple caveats though, which is that a lot of it weren't fleshed, a lot of the decisions weren't fleshed out, and there were some core assumptions in there, including what I call a cafeteria menu model or an a la carte structure. So taking lessons learned from similar organizations like SCAPA or NCPA, it was always very important and intended through the strategic plan that we have a model where members can opt in to joint projects or not. And so really in line with that, we've leaned heavily into what we call the phase 1, 2, 3 structure, where phase 1, everybody gets to look at an idea and kick the tires on it. So everybody has access to phase 1, but you only access phase 2, which is the solicitation, and phase 3, the ongoing project execution, if you participate. And we've tried to map that into the work plans and budget. And I would say that's a very foundational core structure for CC Power at this point. So building on the strategic plan, we, as you know, started doing work planning this year by interviewing everybody, doing these surveys, trying to map the work into properly sequenced phase 1, 2, or 3 ideas, and give a 1-year look. I think the 1-year look is somewhat restrictive, but that was the model we used this year. And then in the future, as we get more projects online and more visibility to where we're taking the organization, we can look at a multi-year planning process. And then lastly, those items feed into the budget. The budget's also a 1-year look, and it includes the revenue and spending plan, or at least an estimated one. And one thing that's noteworthy for this year is that we are trying to show the entire annual work plan with the estimated costs associated with that, and we've grouped them into the phase 1, 2, and 3 structure. So rather than asking for additional funds that you did not expect mid-year, we've tried to anticipate what those funding requests will be and embed them into the budget. One important distinction, though, is that while this budget would be for the whole year, including these estimated plans, we still expect that each member would need to decide on opting into phase 2 or phase 3 projects. And so just because we're budgeting as if that's happened, it doesn't mean you're committing in any way to the phase 2 or phase 3. I think the one issue, though, is that the phase 2 and 3 budget does include some overhead. So some of the estimated money there will be used a little bit for overhead, but we are treating all that as a balancing account. So if your account gets high or low, we can always adjust it. And we expect if yours is high, someone else's are low. And since we track everything as a balancing account, we can manage that and make sure everything's fair. And no one's cross-subsidizing one another. So I'll keep going, but again, I welcome any questions as we go, and jump in if you have anything. Where we're going to go is we'll talk a little bit more through the work plan and then how that feeds into the budget, and then we'll talk budget. So jump in anytime. Okay, just a bit on the strategic plan. So if you go back, and I'm happy to share this, when the plan was constituted, CC Power had an interim executive director, 4 contracts for $2.2 billion, about 263 megawatts, and an online date a few years out. So now it's 2024. I'd say some progress has been made here, and the strategic plan really focused on how CC Power could play an optional role of leveraging the buying power of members to deliver more cost-effective, clean, and reliable solutions for you and your customers. How we could develop, acquire, construct, own, or manage, contract for, engage in, finance, or other projects, programs, and services. How we could grow our capabilities, not just for CC Power, but to serve you and provide longer term member value. And then again, as I mentioned, the strategic plan was, I think, clear on retaining the a la carte offering model. So that really has been the overarching structure that I've been operating under and over the last year. So next slide. So then again, through a lot of check-ins with the board, we've developed this recommended or member-directed work plan. And to give you a feel for it, there's a lot in here, but at a high level, the categories of work are the following. So contract management and the master services agreement or other joint actions. So we have the 4 contracts up to 263 megawatts. This continues to be a top priority, is to manage those, to get those online and support you. As part of that, there are a fair number of duties associated with it, including setting up scheduling coordinator agreements, positioning us for preparing for the prepays, for the geothermal contracts, etc. There's also, I'd say, a lot of ongoing contract management work that goes into that. The second item is loosely categorized as building deal flow and creating opportunities for the members. So we do that through phase 1, and then it's really up to you to decide if it's relevant and you are interested in a phase 2 or 3 participation. This was a heavy emphasis in the work planning process because we wanted to understand what people wanted. And so, as you know, we're doing the build transfer solicitation. We've broken that into a 2A, the sort of initial shortlisting, and then the 2B would be really people who are interested in signing on to the deals, doing final negotiations and financing. So that's the BTA solicitation. There's additional ideas and phase 2 concepts for procurement or emerging technology explorations. There's the offshore wind resolution implementation. The MOU is a feature of that, but for those interested in offshore wind, there's some phase 2 work we're teeing up in the budget. There's analysis and decision support functions. There's additional strategic assessments. And again, the strategic assessment is the phase 1 work where we, with the input of all of your staff through working groups, look at ideas. We sometimes bring in external consultants to advise us and help us get concrete considerations or third-party input, so we're informed. An example of that is where we worked with a leading tax law firm on the Inflation Reduction Act. So they came in and helped advise us as we looked at the BTA concept. We also have bulk buys in there, and we're looking at a few of them, whether they're just information services or others. And then we're also looking at cost savings and shared resource solutions and how that could be a tool in your toolkit. So that I sort of loosely categorize as deal flow. There's other maturation goals we want to achieve in the work plan, credit maturation work and preparation, potential bond issuance, and then some of these multi-year strategies where we would start to build capabilities and tools that could serve the CCAs and our members longer term. And then lastly is sort of caring for the young agency, solidify CC Power's capabilities and longer term design. So making sure we have key or critical functional areas addressed. I've listed these as management, origination, financial valuation or analysis, some project management, some member support and admins or operations, and then some finance capabilities. And then I want to caveat though, as we approach this longer term design, we did check in with you on sort of what's a vision for CC Power for the future. A lot of those decisions are not made in this work plan, but I think some decisions can be addressed in terms of how we resource the organization. On one hand, you can have you can hire staff to resource it. You can rely on member sweat equity, or you can use contractors. CC Power has used all of the above, and we've looked at other similarly situated organizations to help inform us. I think what the budget does is it tries to placeholder some funds for this, and then I can help run CC Power and administer it to achieve the goals that you guys want. One thing to note though is that we're placeholder some of the money, but actually before we spend it, it would be contingent on a sort of green light on a phase 2 or phase 3 work. So a good example of that is if we look at a resource adequacy power pool concept. That such a project would require project management. We don't know if everybody wants to do that yet, so we wouldn't hire a project manager in advance of that. Instead, what we would do is we would do a strategic assessment, a phase 1 project, look at the resource adequacy power pool concept to see if it's viable. And then only if members opted into phase 2, which is where we try to actually make it happen, get people into contract to do it, would we consider the sort of execute on resourcing decisions. So stepping back, this gives you a sense of a large array of work plans. One other thing I wanted to just highlight in this work plan is the master service agreement concept. So this is a concept we've looked at in a couple areas because it's a way to help costs and achieve the mission. Recall the mission talks about our joint power, our joint buying power. And so the MSA is a way of aggregating you guys into a sort of a more scaled contract if you want. So we could approach someone and say, hey, everybody's using this service. If we offer a larger master service agreement where that has scale, would that bring costs down, and could members then opt in underneath the MSA? And so that's a model we're looking at as a way to try and save costs and get return on equity near term. Another benefit of that is it helps facilitate decision making at the same time on key cost areas. So it could be valuable for everybody to join into these MSAs if it's a fit. And we recognize that it may not be a fit for everyone. Okay.
I see a hand from Director Padilla.
Fantastic. Director Padilla, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is maybe the first time that I'm seeing this master service agreement concept. So you're going to need to walk me through it a bit more. What exactly would be what's the service provide? Is it just scheduling coordination and essentially legal support? Or what does that look like? And I guess it would vary depending on which projects you participate in. Is that how that would work?
Yes, all the above. So a quick picture of it, Director Padilla, great question. Scheduling coordinator would be one where we know a lot of CCAs look for and contract for scheduling coordinators. It may be that we could explore doing a master services agreement for scheduling coordination such that members who want can bring their portfolio in and get it scheduled through that contract structure. And in turn, the scheduling coordinator service provider would offer a slightly discounted price because we're giving them more scale. So it's a way to try and get scale in the contracting function here for scheduling coordinator or similar duties. And I would say that's kind of, as you know, front office and back office. And then another version of that might be many CCAs use a few contractors for metering and billing services. And so that might be another one we could discuss with those service providers in an MSA and see if that's a fit and something they're willing to do to try and achieve greater scale.
Okay, so it's not limited to the projects at CC Power. It can go beyond those projects.
Yeah, and there is a synergy here though, because CC Power also has its contracts and we'll be lining up a scheduling coordinator for that. So we're gonna have to contract for that anyway. So one thing we could do is run a solicitation for an SC service or to give us their pricing, not just for us, but for a master service contract and see if there might be cost savings for all of us, including on the CC Power contracts. Does that help? And happy to meet with you offline to talk this through further if that's if you want to dialogue further. Okay. Great. So I think I've touched on the work plan enough. Hopefully this helps you get a feel for what your input was and you see that we've really tried hard to take all the results of the surveys and the interviews with you and embed it into the work plan. Okay, next slide, please. Well, I spoke too soon. So a few additional areas in the work plan that didn't really get called out. In some ways, these are small one-offs. We do want to move forward with a board event in the fall. That would be a chance to build on the considerations of where we take CC Power. And so I'll work with our general counsel on getting that set up in a sort of compliant way. And if we have to have public participation, we'll have it. What we've been doing is we've checked in with Director Sears from Valley Clean Energy about hosting this in-person event in Davis, which is not too far for many of you, and also has some kind of neat tours in the area that might help with idea generation. A good example is they have this lighting center that's quite interesting to tour. And so it'd be fun to package a few of those sort of eye-opening tours with this strategic consideration. One other thing about the board event is it would also be sequenced just prior to the CAISO symposium. So for those of you from the Bay Area or elsewhere coming up to Davis, you could then, if you're interested, head straight to Sacramento for the CAISO symposium, which would start that evening. So I think we've got that lined up and there's a placeholder on everybody's schedule. We also are going to, in the event, in the work areas, maybe do some further external engagement and just help people know CC Power exists. As part of the phase 1 work, we've found it's very helpful to do these site tours or pre-origination work so that your staff are in a better position to, engage in deliberations on what projects might be of interest to you and your organization. And then, as I mentioned, some of these organizational enhancements. A good example of that is a small HR service to make sure we have an HR handbook. So the organizational enhancements, in a way, are very administrative. Any questions on that? Let's please move on to the next slide. So I've spoken at length on the phase 1, 2, and 3 structure. I wanted to touch on it again because it's so core to understanding the budget and how we do the work planning and how it fits with the cafeteria menu style. So here's just a visual of phase 1 where all members have access and our file sharing structure would map to this. This is where we do what I call the strategic assessments. That's the idea of a project and we're deciding if there's member interest. We try and vet it. We try and bring numbers and do some quantitative analysis to help people know if it's a viable and compelling opportunity for joint action. And we use primarily working groups there. Phase 2, as you know, is sort of the idea to contracting phase. That's where you typically would see a solicitation and negotiation. The costs are shared by participants according to the project. And in some ways that's been equal sharing, but there could also be ways where we share differently in the costs. And phase 2 is designed for participants only. So it's only if you're willing to cover those costs that you and your organization participate in phase 2. And you must opt in. No one's defaulted into phase 2. And then by the end of phase 2, there's usually a specific negotiated deal on the table, and members can decide to sign or not sign. And for those that do sign, they move with that project into phase 3. Again, you have to have willingly opted into that. And then phase 3 covers the entire project execution phase. So there in many cases may be ongoing project work potentially for years if it's a long-term contract or PPA. So I think everyone understands that, but just wanted to give you this visual and remind everyone this is really core to how we plan the work. Okay, next slide. And so now I've taken that phase 1, 2, 3, and I've placed the work plan into it. Admittedly, it's highly generalized because I didn't think anyone wanted a 1,000-word slide. But on phase 1, you see that's where we're doing the strategic assessments for power supply related projects with the resource planning working group. To Director Padilla's question earlier, we would be road mapping with members on these MSAs. So again, we're not doing the MSA, we're just looking at the potential cost savings of an MSA in these areas, and that's a phase 1 project. We would it also embedded in the work plan is sort of further exploration on data services and having shared data resources. And so through phase 1 would be the assessments of the data joint action projects. And I know data means a lot to people. So that would really be a phase 1 work where we try to define it, make sure there's value for the members, try and crunch some numbers to see if that's a cost savings area, etc. And then in line with the work plan, we may do some limited consideration of program activities. This is really a strong item in the strategic plan, maybe a medium to low item in the work plan. And so we don't want to go so far with program concepts at this time, but some limited consideration in phase 1 does seem productive and affordable. And then lastly, the phase 1 is where all the working groups are. Again, jump in with any questions. I'll run through phase 2 and 3. Phase 2, where there's a lot of interesting ideas here, would be continuation of the phase 2 BTA phase 2A, which is getting us from designing a solicitation to running a solicitation. Then that might have a short list with pricing. Phase 2B would be only for interested parties to go in and try and actually contract on the 2B and see what's out of the short list. Phase 2 would also be where we do some of this prepay preparatory work. On one hand, we are planning to prepay some of our PPAs that we have, and it may make sense to join up with other CCAs who may have additional resources to add to the portfolio, specifically for the prepay, because if you have the right size in the prepay, it can be a cost saving strategy, so that could be valuable. Another phase 2 item would be require an opt-in. This is the further offshore wind work. And so we've started to design and look beyond just the phase 1 work. And only for those interested, there's an opportunity here with some further offshore wind work. As I mentioned, if we like the MSAs, we then would start to execute and design them in phase 2. So you see the MSAs again here. And also this RA power pool concept is another one we would look at. And then some bulk buys or volume buys. And we know that we've already done 2 of these on information services. So in the work plan, we reasonably assume we may end up contracting again for those types of information services. And we try to estimate what those costs might be. And then lastly, the phase 3 is, it's pretty light for, say, an information service. There's almost nothing to administer, right? But for projects where you have contract management, like the firm clean resource and long duration storage projects, there's a fair amount of phase 3 work in terms of shepherding those projects along and gearing up for operations. A good example here would be lining up a scheduling coordinator for the LDS resources. We may also, or we are recommending a training service. This training service would be something that's set up. It's a computer-based training, and then only if members want can their staff take the training. And so then that incurs a small cost associated with using the training service. And then the recurring project execution, information services, etc. So that's a new look of how the work plan maps into phase 1, 2, and 3. I know I've been speaking for a while, so feel free to jump in or ask any questions. And otherwise, let's keep moving. Okay, so what does all that mean? So we looked at a lot of different numbers. We have a bottoms up budget that really maps directly from the strategic plan and the work plan ideas and translates that into specific line items on spreadsheets. And a lot of these numbers have been researched and vetted. Some of them are not exciting numbers. For instance, there's insurance requirements associated with having our PPAs. So we have an insurance broker and we get those cost quotes. Some of them are more interesting and dynamic where we say, okay, if there is a phase 2B, what goes into that phase 2B? And I've worked with Philippe and others to start to design and estimate that. And as many of you know, the way we've approached these phase 2 decisions is typically with the cost range and then a not to exceed. So we kind of use that same model here where we start to get into what specifically execution on that phase 2 project or phase 3 work would look like. We have some placeholders. In some cases, there's set asides for risk items or legal fees we want to anticipate, et cetera. So there's a lot that goes into the budget. And the latest, and where we tried to land for this meeting was with a recommended budget. So previously we had put out a preliminary budget and now you'll see a recommended budget. The recommended budget where we've really worked with a lot of items is a $4.9 million budget. 3.6 million is project, meaning it's typically phase 2 and 3 costs, and 1.2 million in G&A, and G&A is really administering CC Power, building our reserves, and running the phase 1 strategic assessments. So I sort of repeat all that here with the G&A at 1.2. And just as a reminder on the reserve building, going all the way back to last year, we set out on a plan for building about 6 months of operating reserves. We loosely define that as half of the G&A because G&A funds are really administrative funds. The projects need to pay for themselves through members, so we don't try to build cash reserves for projects. We have a completely different model for building cash reserves for projects. So the reserve building number is really designed to just address G&A cash needs, okay? So let's move on. There's another couple slides here that I think will help. These numbers are bigger than last year. And so one thing that is we're learning is our budget process with it probably needs to improve in future years. You know, the major shift for this year was to start to include estimated phase 2 and 3 work. But we realized that some of you need more time to go take these cost estimates and budget items through your own process. And so it's also highlighting a couple important things. When some of you signed on to projects, for instance, the long duration storage project, there was always recognition that you were going to get cost items and your board had already signed on for the sort of PPA price of that. We're now addressing how do we recover that money? How do we invoice you? And the model and the contracts is to invoice typically 3 months ahead. Since none of the projects are online though, what we're doing is invoicing for sort of the full year estimate. And then as I mentioned, we hold it in these balancing accounts for you. And once it's material, we'll also track interest. And so I think we also want to have a better way of helping you know when we invoice you, what is a quote procurement cost, which is something many of you deal with every month already, and what is a non-procurement cost. And in the non-procurement cost budget bucket, you would have the G&A invoice, which is a once a year invoice. Then you may have these other quote project invoices, but they would not be defined as procurement. So that's the level of sophistication where we really need to improve, and then we also need to make sure everybody can approve the budget.
Jan Morris, I just want to underscore the value of that distinction and
Yeah.
encourage you to consult with maybe a CPA on how to standardize that distinction for the rest of us, because I think obviously we don't want to be spending $20 million on a trade association, when really most of that is procurement. And I know that's never the intent, but as we start scaling up, suddenly that'll become an issue. So thanks.
Absolutely, Chair Cyphers, thank you. Yeah, and I think if this is becoming clear, I have outreach to similar organizations to try and talk through the nitty-gritty details of how they do similar accounting, because again, this isn't really new. And for you guys, it's not new to have procurement costs flowing through your organization. So we want to make sure we track and label everything properly and then invoice in a way that's workable for everyone. That said, we're in 2024, and so the sequence we have now was the preliminary budget was released and then discussed last month, and then now we have this recommended budget. And where we likely will go from here is that there'll be ongoing conversations and discussion, and then members will consider the recommended budget or some version of that in their approval process, and then we can come back here in June for our approval process before we start our next fiscal year in July. So let me pause there, and then we'll get to more numbers in a second. All right. I was going to say Director Hyams, but Mike,
Alternate
go
director.
ahead.
Thanks, GM Morris. I really, first of all, just appreciate all the additional detail and the discussion that you've facilitated here for us. I'm trying to better understand kind of what I think of in my mind as the distinction between kind of like committed project costs for us and uncommitted. And I know that one of your goals with this budget is to kind of like effectuate the board's strategic plan. But at least to date for us, we have been able to commit project costs, or we've been able to, I guess, pay CC Power for project costs related to commitments we've made. What I'm trying to understand, and I'll frame it as a question now, is hypothetically, if the board adopts your recommended budget, do you anticipate that you'd be seeking to collect, say, the full project budget from members following that approval, or would there be some sequence to collecting it maybe in chunks related to commitments that members make?
A fantastic question. I think I really understand it. So there'd be, the way I look at that, Director Hyams, is there's sort of, on one hand is the G&A invoice. So I think of it as two different invoices. One is the G&A invoice, which is typically a sort of like a dues invoice. And we can issue that. Then the project invoice is one where I want more sophistication, particularly for future years, because in the future, the project invoice will have estimated invoices for many PPA projects worth millions of dollars. So we do not want to invoice people a year in advance for PPA costs next June, right? The model instead that's embedded in the contracts is there's a 3-month lead on any expected cash flow, net cash flows. So for next year, what I envision is the project invoice is much more broken apart into committed project costs, as you've said, where we have a pretty analytical estimate of what the cost will be based on PPA prices and or market forecasts, things like that. And this is all actually structured in the contracts as well. And then there might be this other category of projects, which, as you've worded, would be uncommitted. And I'm very open to different ways for how we would invoice that. The way we've approached it this year, or I'm approaching it this year, is sort of in line with last year's. We've just had these two invoices. But I think as costs grow, we have to be much more careful about that model. And then one other thing I mentioned is I've worked with our accountant on starting to track interest accruals. If we're holding material amounts of your money, we have set up the groundwork for that, in that each one of your dollars is tracked in a specific account and registered to you. So now we can apply any interest the accounts earn back to you in a prorated way. And so the total interest over the last 12 months, and I have looked at this, was, I would say, de minimis. So when I worked with the accountant, it really wasn't worth it to go through the accounting of that. But as the numbers grow, that's definitely something we need to set up, and we have the structure for it. And I don't know exactly when we'll implement, but presumably in this upcoming year. Yeah, does that address your question, or do you have
Yeah,
follow-ons?
that is helpful. And maybe that's, I think we were hoping to have maybe a follow-on conversation with you
Okay.
and in advance of the vote on the budget next month. So maybe we can talk through that concept a little bit further.
Perfect. I'd welcome that. Thank you.
Maybe as a follow-on to that question, is it fair to say that your budget is showing an optimistic scenario of project participation, and actual expenses might be a little less if people end up not participating? Is that fair? Or distributed differently, rather?
Definitely distributed differently if people
Yeah.
don't participate. And then in some
Right.
cases, yeah, we didn't want to over budget because we don't think that's responsible, Chair Cyphers, but we are trying to reasonably reflect and make informed guesses on what the cost would be. So good examples in this budget, we're estimating a phase 2B project. Now we don't know who's going to participate, but we have talked to engineering firms, and if you look at what a phase 2B would entail, it would require engineering reviews of probably 3 projects. And so we've talked to engineering firms and owners engineers and said, okay, looking way ahead, and we don't know if we'll go there yet, how much would it cost to have a really detailed engineering review of a project so that our team could make an informed decision on if they want that project or not, and if it's viable, what the risks are, et cetera. That's also really relevant because you're looking not only at sort of electrical viability, but also at potential direct pay compliance and labor compliance. So there would be a lot that goes into those engineering reviews of projects. And again, we're estimating that, but we have numbers provided from, legitimate entities. And then another estimate is we can kind of estimate legal costs for some of these. So we know we're going to want counsel, for instance, bond counsel. So how many hours do we estimate? We know we have rates and we're lining up contracts with bond counsel, but
Right.
again, we're still
I think
eyeballing
I was asking because I know you've been pushed in the past to adopt an annual budget where it's unlikely to need mid-year adjustments, because that can take some work on our members' side. And I know that does mean you have to lean forward a little. And so I appreciate that, because I think that's responsive to the board. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So let's move to the next slide then. Okay, so I wanted to also provide a little sense of scale for how the organization is clearly growing and proposing to grow. So in 2022, which at the end of 2022 was when the strategic plan was adopted, by the way. So you had a $1.1 million budget that had a part-time interim executive director. Then in 2023, I was hired and we hired Philippe. We also have sort of expanded the offerings. And what you can see in the 2023 budget was that we had a G&A invoice total, we had a project total, but then we had mid-year project invoices of about $600,000. Okay. And so that ended up with a total of 2.4 million, but you should really notice the mid-year invoice of something versus now what we're trying to do in the 2024 preliminary from April, but now the 2024 recommended is we have the G&A, we have a project budget that reflects the estimated phase 2 and 3 work. And then we're hoping for a 0 mid-year project invoice, because we know that can be disruptive and hard to plan for. So what you see is really going from 1.1 to 2.4, and then now to around 4.9 under the 2024 recommended. Okay. All right, let's move on. So there's one other really important point that goes on in the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet looks at a lot of cost line items, project participation share, historical project participation and estimated project participation. And so we use all of that to allocate some of the anticipated phase 2 and 3 costs. And so a good example is that if there is a cost item associated directly with a project that has project share information, we allocate those estimated costs based on the project share, which is very logical. But in some cases, we allocate based on an estimated approach, which might be an equivalent, everybody participates. So for instance, in the phase 2A project, we have 9 members participating, so everyone gets 1/9 of the share of the costs. And then we also look at a potential load weighted sharing. That's relevant because if we try and do procurement, we may want strong credit entities taking larger shares because that keeps costs down. And then the credit risk of smaller parties is quote wrapped in that. So we can assume that larger parties might take larger shares, and that's logical. So we use all of that. So now look here and you see the G&A where everybody pays equally. And then in the project participation, you see a lot of different numbers. And those numbers really reflect a bunch of things. What have you participated in? How many costs are associated with that project? What might you participate in? How large are you? And what assumptions were we making about potential participation in projects, et cetera? So underneath that project participation number is, I'd say, a lot of thinking about cost allocation, trying to make it as fair and appropriate as possible, and representative also of what we think will happen if people move forward on projects. So it's sort of logical to see that parties that have participated in all 4 of our projects will naturally have a significantly higher project participation budget than parties that haven't participated in some of the projects. So I can pause there and would love to have some board discussion of this, Chair Cyphers and Vice Chair Mitchell.
Is that the last of your slides? Or do you have some more that you'll go to next after? we
Yeah,
take
there's
these?
just the next slide is an empty discussion slide. It's probably easier if we leave this on the screen.
Perfect. All right, so I'll recognize Director Shaw first.
Thank you, Chair Cyphers. General Manager Morris, I think slide 13, you mentioned it, but I missed the date when you were looking for action on the budget.
Thank you, Director Shaw. Good to see you. We are looking for approval in June so that we can start our fiscal cycle. One wrinkle is that we have been rescheduling the June board meeting. Originally, it was scheduled for a date of Juneteenth. We didn't think that was appropriate. So when we rescheduled it, the date it was rescheduled to is not working. So now we're rescheduling it again. So I don't actually have that board date available today, unfortunately.
I raise it because we are going to be invoicing for phase 2A of the BTA proposal, and then we'll have opt-ins for phase 2B. And I'm wondering, what from a project participation in the project portion of the budget, what impact there would be, and whether you will know that impact to be able to adjust numbers based on projected participation in that project.
Great question. I understand what you're asking. So phase 2A has all 9 members wanting to participate, and we will not have enough information for members to decide on 2B for months. We're going to run the solicitation over the summer, so we won't really have pricing and shortlist information until late Q3 or Q4. So unfortunately, what we're in a position now of trying to estimate it.
Okay.
And the way we're estimating phase 2B costs is by sort of size-based allocation. So larger entities are expected to get to pick up slightly larger shares. We know that's not exactly how it'll work in reality, but it just gives us a number and a placeholder that we'll adjust off of it through the balancing accounts. Does that make sense?
It does. And I appreciate all of the work that you and Director Sears have put into both the budget, communicating the budget, the work you did in communicating this today. I really appreciate all of the work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll go to Director Marshall.
Great. Thank you. And I would echo the gratitude expressed by Director Hall. A question for you, maybe this is a question even for other directors, and that is that as we enter our budget cycle, I imagine all of you are in similar timing here with adoption of your next fiscal year budget. So you have here the G&A, which, you know, we might allocate under our membership dues category. And then the project participation amount, I understand, is a placeholder for now, if I understand you correctly. And then sort of predicated upon whether or not we advance through phase 2. Can you say a little bit more, Director, about when you think those pieces would be invoiced? So just really sort of thinking about it from when we book these potential expenses. And do you anticipate that all of this then would come through? For example, our fiscal year is June 30th through, or July 1 through June 30th. So could you say a little bit more about the timing? Thank you.
Certainly, and maybe Chair Cipher. So on the first question of how you or CCAs may normally label the G&A dues, anything that members want to respond on that before we talk about project costs?
I don't want to speak for other CCAs at all, but I think we have viewed everything to date as being a membership expense, even the early stage negotiations of agreements with the 4 existing contracts. And we're going to have to pick a line when the procurement costs start kicking in. But I don't want to suggest that we know what other CCAs should do in their standard reporting. So I'll say that much at least.
And Director Marshall, just one thing I can say from working with the accountant we work with, CC Power is now getting more interesting in the sense that the materiality is growing. So heretofore, everything's been what he might sort of normally categorize as immaterial. And so something he would sort of, tag as being expended in that cycle and not carry over because everything was small. But now he and I are in conversations about what's the materiality threshold we're going to live with, how's he account, and how's that show up in the financial statements, and then does that work with what you guys need when we invoice, et cetera. So some of that work is still TBD on all of the budget items. And then I'll keep going, but I see some hand raised, so I think those are future questions. So then Director Marshall on project participation. So what this shows, and I'll just use PCE as an example, you have the 474,808 number as your project. So sort of the easiest approach is we invoice you 474,808. And then we received the payment, we hold it on the project accounts. What that means is that 474,808 actually has multiple, it sort of gets placed into these sub items. And then when we expend money one way or another, it sort of pulls from these expense items, which overall lowers your account. And then we would sort of net out where we are at the end of the year with who participated and what changes need to be made. And then in some cases, it's reasonable to assume that at the end of the year, you might have extra money in that account and that wasn't spent. And so the theory would then be, well, what do we do with it? Do we give it back to you? Or do we then reduce your next project invoice by that applicable amount? So that's another issue where we're now material enough. We want to have that figured out for next year. But currently what I was proposing to do was just do the one invoice. And I think Director Hyams was also asking about this. What's the best way to invoice you for that? Is a single invoice of 474,808 easiest, or do you need it more by project level? And so we could do that too. When we look at the by project level, there's also still a lot of assumptions, frankly. And so it's sort of easiest if we just do the one thing and then we're accounting and pulling from the projects and accounting on our end. And then we just show you and present you back how much is left in each one of these balancing accounts.
Okay, so the answer though is that potentially this full amount, in our case of 611,000, would be invoiced upfront as part of our next fiscal year budget. How we choose to book that is up to us.
Correct.
But that's the hit that's coming, so.
Yeah, and it would be two invoices though. The G&A for sure would be a separate invoice. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to Director Mitchell.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and also thank you, Director Sears, for presenting the budget. I know this is a lot of hard work, and I've been in a lot of those discussions, so really appreciate it. And I just want to recognize, I think it's exciting that CC Power is at this inflection point where, you know, the project participation and, you know, we're talking about the budget and the accounting for that, and these projects coming online is just going to take a lot more resource. So I really want to commend you for getting in front of that and thinking this through. I am somewhat like Jeff, just for people's knowledge. To date, we have booked it all as under one. I think this year may be the year that we start to pull out the G&A from the project participation. And I'm supportive of how you've presented this here, Alex, for this year, where the project participation is all lumped together. But I do think in the future for next fiscal year's budget, and I appreciate there's a lot of work to be done with the accountant. But I think where we all need to go for the future is to break it out project by project, just so that we can align our accounting. But I very much appreciate the startup nature of CC Power and that we're not quite there yet. And so thank you for that and all the hard work on this. I think what that results in for us is probably some money, you know, kind of prepaid sitting there, and you know, I'm supportive of that. I, you know, definitely want CC Power to continue to explore the items that we've all agreed to in the strategic plan, as well as, you know, continue to work on the projects that we've all signed up for. So just really appreciate all the hard work here, and you know, you and your very small team working with all of us to you know, understand these invoicing issues and work with us in order to get through our own individual processes, because I know that, you know, we are at a growing inflection point here with the organization, which I think is really exciting, and excited to see where CC Power goes in the future.
Thank you, Director Vice Chair Mitchell. I'm very excited too, and the work plan is exciting, certainly.
Thanks.
Sorry, go ahead.
Let's go to Director Padilla.
All right, well, I certainly echo a lot of the sentiments shared by other directors, but I am going to ask maybe a few more questions. I think I've got some of the answers based on some of what I've heard you say already, but a couple of just questions on that 4.9 million budget, where you're allocating 75% to projects, both known projects and potential projects, versus 25% to G&A. How did you come up with that determination, just at a very high level?
Yeah, so great question. So inside the spreadsheet, every line item, actually there you get to decide what it's attributable to. So the way we develop the spreadsheet is every expense we look at, and we have a methodology for how you decide if it's G&A versus project and what percentage. So we try to adhere to that methodology. And then in some cases, you say it's directly attributable to a single project. And the spreadsheet then knows, okay, do I take this money, I assign it directly to this project, and then I allocate the cost to the members based on cost share? Or is it just a general project cost that then needs to be allocated according to some other methodology? So the spreadsheet does that. And we adhere to this methodology we've developed in there, really about which phase should it be in, and who participates.
Okay, because another way to have potentially have approached this is that you just assign more of it to G&A, right? And then you don't run the risk of, if you don't get the participation that you need in phase 2 and phase 3, you don't have to go back and recalculate what everybody's per share participation rate would be, right? But yeah, so that was one general question. And then I certainly support Director Mitchell's statement about more transparency going forward, recognizing that we are in this, you know, kind of growing stage of CC Power, and we can't be perfect or there yet, but certainly having the cost of GNA, or not GNA, I guess the overhead related at CC Power, other costs, and then the commodity costs associated with the projects, if there is commodity associated with the project, like the firm clean resources or revenue and costs like the long duration storage broken out separately would make it much easier for us to be able to track and get the necessary funding from our board, or at least from my board, when these projects and cost increases come up in the future. And I think NCPA does a great job of distinguishing, commodity versus non-commodity costs. And if you can get a copy of their very detailed budget, highly recommend it. They go through a lot of effort to project those, net revenue, CAISO costs, everything else. The other question I had is, and I apologize because, again, I'm new to this board, and so there's probably some context and information that was provided in previous meetings that I perhaps have not been privy to, but I understand that the FY 24-25 work plan was informed by the surveys to some extent, right? Not entirely, but to some extent. I'd be interested to see what the surveys resulted in and how the members prioritize these different projects and how it actually aligns with the FY 24-25 and I guess potentially future budgets. So if you could make that available to me, I'd really appreciate it. And then I also wanted to add that, I think that this concept of asking for all the money up front and then returning it to us at the end of the year, should we not participate in one of the projects. I understand the simplicity of that, right? From your standpoint, you get the money, you can hire the consultants or the staff that you need and get these things going. But it is kind of a challenge for me to be able to explain that to my board, and maybe it's not, but these are quite significant numbers relative to what we had before. So I'll have to make that explanation to them about how we might participate in these projects. And then if we don't, we'd get the money back. Or we might participate in these projects, but if not enough participants participate, we may end up paying more and having to pay more later at some point as well. So that's the other risk too, right?
Yes.
I do like the idea of having those cash calls done more than once, so not all of it up front, to kind of deal with some of that uncertainty. And it's not a lot of money, but it's more just the transparency and the being able to explain it as well. But aside from that, I generally support what we're trying to do here at CC Power. Obviously, Silicon Valley Clean Energy was on board with much of the strategic plan and much of the concept of CC Power, and so and I understand how complicated joint procurement is and these types of things, and how it's hard. And I certainly appreciate all the work that you and your team and anybody else on the board has put into developing this very complicated but yet very simplified presentation of a budget. So those are all my comments.
Thank you, Director Padilla. And I took some notes here, so I'll follow up on getting you some of those information items you requested.
And thanks. And before there's maybe an action or a direction from board on the multiple invoices or the cash calls, which is something I would prefer. But I also know that some of the city members in the past have requested budgets that don't require those kind of mid-year elements. So I might request GM Morris that you kind of check in with San Francisco and San Jose and see how they feel about that and make sure we're attending to everybody here. So I'll turn to Director Sears.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Cyphers and General Manager Morris. Thanks very much for the detailed presentation. I think this is helpful each time we go through it for just sort of bring everyone up to speed. But I did want to just sort of pull out that point that Jeff just made, which is I think that this is a compromise in terms of the cash call versus the overall sort of lump sum approach, recognizing that some of us do have a more complicated process to go through. I think San Francisco and San Jose are the prime examples of that. And so I think that it could have very easily gone sort of either way, and there's advantages and disadvantages to doing either, but that's my understanding of what that background is as well. One thing I wanted to ask, and Alex, I should have probably talked with you about this when we were sort of eyeball deep in the spreadsheets and everything, but there's nothing magical about CC Power's fiscal year. I mean, we can start it and end it, you know, as long as it's a year, we can start it and end it at any time. And I'm just wondering, not to complicate matters, and certainly not in this particular cycle, but I think most, we're not in this boat, VCE is not in this boat, but I think all the other CCAs have a more typical, you know, July to June fiscal year. And whether or not this information lands early enough to be able to be incorporated into budget planning for all the different members, that may need be something else to consider going forward. I mean, if we all at CC Power approve the budget on an annual basis, let's say in April, and then that would give time for those numbers to be incorporated more easily into individual members' budgets. Again, not looking to complicate matters, but just wanted to put that out there. But again, thanks for all the work that you put in on this. I think it's a delicate balance that you're trying to achieve, but I appreciate the thoroughness.
Thank you, Director Sears, and thanks also for your service as treasurer and being one of the primary victims of, you know, having to run through every line item. So thank you.
All right, Director Hyams.
Thank you, Chair Cyphers. Yeah, and I just want to thank everyone for the comments here. I think a lot of what I've been hearing resonates, and you know, definitely appreciate the challenge that is before General Manager Morris in maturing the organization and growing it. And you know, just acknowledging here that relative to previous budgets, we're seeing you know, noticeable increase. And because of that, on our side, we've been talking a lot about this concept of sort of guardrails on spending. And I think a similar concept has come up just from Director Padilla and Vice Chair Mitchell. Want to just echo the concept of trying to build out the project budget around specific projects. Maybe that's an aspirational structure for the future, but I think it will help us with our approval process and being able to associate money flowing out our door with specific things that we're committing to.
Thanks. All right, we'll go back to Vice Chair Mitchell.
Thanks. I'll just make this really short, but in terms of some of the comments around, you know, different invoicing structures, you know, I think if we are breaking out projects by individual projects, that works for us. That's not something, you know, I'll let Mike speak for San Francisco, but for San Jose in the future, you know, that's something we can accommodate. But I would appreciate certainly any work, especially as the budget grows with the project side, you know, kind of early work to understand what the fiscal year ahead is, just so that we have that in our budget. You know, I would expect our budget, like many of you, the procurement side is already a very big number for us. So, you know, this fits fine. But I think having that earlier heads up on, you know, just project procurement costs is helpful. But we certainly can accommodate a different invoicing structure that aligns a little bit more closely with the project participation in the future. But I think for this year, it is helpful just for CC Power to have the money in an account. That was also some of the background of why we've done it this way in the past, is just because CC Power is such a young organization, and it's just important for you to have the cash to be able to pay for the services you're providing and making sure that CC Power is financially stable as well. So really supportive of all the work on this and, you know, how we're doing it this year. But as always with any new organization, lots of areas to continue to work on in the future. So thanks again, Alex.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
Any other comments from the board? I'll add my own, just brief. I think Jim Morris, you've navigated this very skillfully. I think pulling back a bit from the draft was probably prudent. I think I'm also aware that it's not a budget that supports the more aggressive edge of the strategic business plan. And so I think when we go to your review, we have to keep that in mind, that we didn't give you a budget for the most aggressive kind of playbook in there. But I'm supportive of this, and I'll be certainly in favor of adopting it next month. When we find a date, that may be our top priority. So I'll leave my comments there, and then I will go to public comment. So do we have any public comment on the budget discussion? I don't see any hands up. So that will take us to any public comment on our closed session items. Number 7. And we're not expecting a report out from closed session. So if I don't see any hands on this, what we'll do is close this Zoom platform, go to closed session, and then we will adjourn the meeting out of closed session. Is that correct, General Counsel?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So let's do that. So you all have a link in your inboxes, and we will see you there in 2 minutes. Thanks, everyone.